The Crusaders of 1096 had to march through bandit country from Nicaea to Jerusalem, with no hope of flight or rescue should they suffer a major defeat. The Second Crusaders still had to fight their way through part of Asia Minor, but they had potentially friendly territory to utilise for a substantial part of their journey. The First Crusade, for example, had to spend 9 months besieging Antioch. For their successors in 1147, Antioch was a friendly city and a refuge after the hardships of crossing Asia Minor. Secondly, there was the issue of coherence and command. The First Crusade had comprised half a dozen different armies, mainly French-speaking, but recruited from different areas and commanded by different territorial princes, most of whom were on an equivalent level of social and political importance, one with another. Hardly surprisingly, therefore, they were reluctant to defer to each other, despite the occasional efforts of Count Raymond of Toulouse to claim overall command of the expedition. The leadership of the First Crusade was thus vested in what we might perceive of as, in our terms, a board of directors, even if one prince, often Bohemond of Taranto, might take actual tactical command on the battlefield. But when the pressure was relaxed, the princes frequently disagreed, and at times, notably after the capture of Antioch in June 1098, their quarrels threatened to bring the First Crusade to a premature conclusion. The Second Crusade in the East was, however, commanded by kings. If it was composed of two separate armies, there was no doubt who was in command of each of them, and relations between Conrad of Germany and Louis of France remained apparently amicable through the course of the Crusade, perhaps helped by the fact that Conrad was much the older and more experienced of the two rulers. Conrad himself wrote home in January 1148 to describe how the two armies had eventually met up in Asia Minor. The King of France was distressed that our army had been worn down by hunger and toil, but showed no little joy in our company. Indeed, he and all his princes faithfully and devotedly offered us their assistance. They provided us with money and whatever else they had which we wanted. They then joined forces with us and our princes. So, divided command was not the problem for the Second Crusade, that it very much was for the First. The question of numbers is unanswerable. We may make reasonably informed guesses as to the possible sizes of Crusader armies, but whether the forces of the First Crusade were appreciably larger than those of the Second cannot be estimated, nor indeed how far the diversion of the Saxon forces to the attack on the Wends may have weakened the German army. Contemporaries certainly thought that the armies Conrad and Louis led were very large, and at least at first, shortage of numbers was hardly a problem. The difficulty was rather to find food for all those who marched on the expedition. When Conrad wrote home in January 1148, after his army had been defeated by the Turks at Dorylaeum, and he himself had returned sick to Constantinople, he did not complain that he was short of troops. Why, then, did things go wrong? First of all, there was the question of what the original plan for the Crusade was. Pope Eugenius III had addressed his original appeal largely to the Kingdom of France, and he seems, at first, to have envisaged a largely French crusade, as of course the First Crusade was largely French or French-speaking. That Conrad III and the Kingdom of Germany became involved was primarily due to the principal preacher and recruiting agent of the Crusade, the Cistercian Abbot Bernard of Clairvaux. Admittedly, Bernard had been diverted to the Rhineland to begin with to put a stop to attacks on the Jewish communities in that region that were being encouraged by a renegade Cistercian monk called Rudolf. But he took advantage of his presence there to encourage King Conrad himself and his leading men to take the cross, which he did successfully when he and the king met at Speyer over Christmas of 1146. There is no evidence to suggest that this was on the instructions or even with the knowledge of the Pope. Quite the contrary. Bernard, the leading spiritual figure of his day and the self-appointed chief spokesman and propagandist for the emergent and highly successful Cistercian order, was, not for the first time in his career, acting on his own initiative. He was, as we would say, a thoroughly loose cannon. Or, if we want to put it in other terms, as one who was, even in his lifetime, widely regarded as a saint, he took his instructions directly from God, which of course gave him carte blanche to interpret and amend his brief, even one set by the Pope himself. But when Conrad wrote to Pope Eugenius in March 1147 to inform him of the preparations being made for the expedition, he apologised for assuming the cross and setting off for the east without your knowledge. Eugenius might indeed have preferred to have had Conrad's assistance in taming the turbulent population of Rome, which had recently overthrown the Pope's government of the city, and also in assisting him against the hostile King Roger of Sicily, whom Conrad himself had good reason to dislike, since Roger had established his new kingdom on what the German king and Holy Roman Emperor-elect considered to be rightfully imperial territory. Furthermore, Conrad had not yet received his coronation as emperor. By tradition, this had to be by the Pope and in Rome, so there were good reasons to expect him to make an expedition to Italy, but not to the east, until Bernard of Clairvaux intervened. Now, the participation of the German ruler, the most powerful monarch of 12th century Europe, might be considered an obvious advantage for the Crusade. The involvement of the German army greatly enhanced its numbers and military power, and the German court already enjoyed good relations with the Byzantine Emperor Manuel Comnenus. Both of these rulers were united by a common hostility to King Roger and his new kingdom of Sicily, and Manuel had indeed married a German princess in 1145. Yet, as it turned out, the involvement of the Germans was far from being an unqualified advantage to the Crusade. For a start, good as relations between the rulers seemingly were, the two armies did not work together, or indeed take to each other. The Germans were unbearable, even to us, commented Odo of Dai, the French king's chaplain. And above all, the presence of two distinct armies exacerbated the logistical problems of the Crusade. The German army set off from Regensburg in May 1147. The French, who had obviously further to march, set off about a month later. The Germans marched ahead of the French to Constantinople and then crossed the Bosphorus and set off on their own into Asia Minor in October 1147, with the French still following behind. What this meant for the French was that when they arrived in a district, most of the available food supplies had already been consumed by the Germans, and given the uncertain discipline of the German army, as tended to be the case with large medieval armies, the local inhabitants, even in Christian territory, were usually resentful and often downright hostile and unwilling to help the French. The history of Odo of Dai, our main contemporary account of the French Crusade, written by a participant who, as the chaplain of the king, was notably well informed, is full of complaints about the untrustworthiness, the hostility, even the downright wickedness of the Byzantines. Yet much of this was the product of having not one, but two large foreign armies marching through their midst expecting food to be available for purchase or even provided for free. Subsistence agrarian economies did not produce such a big surplus that this was always possible, and matters were much more difficult for the French, who came second.